How small should the government be? Can a small government fight against cartels? Or even a better question, should the government fight against cartels and so-called monopolies? And if yes, is that fight really that efficient or indeed desirable as way too many people seem to think? What challenges are to be expected? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is a request from one of our patrons to whom we are deeply thankful for his generous and consistent support for our operations. The question of how small should the government be is a very legitimate one for two reasons. One being that clarity is preferable, and two, because in the context of those of us who believe in liberty, it's essentially our very own "and then what?" question. As said in multiple other videos, every movement, regardless of its aim, should ask itself repeatedly, and then what? What happens after you win? And the movement must have at least a partial response to that question, or at the very least admit that it doesn't have an answer and that it defers to the wisdom of the next generations. This is a question that early Marxists never even asked, for instance, with the results that we all know. The same goes with other radical movements such as feminism, all forms of anarchism, Greenpeace, and the wider environmentalist eco-Marxist movement, and so on and so forth. There are examples of movements who did ask the question and had an answer for it. One such example is the abolitionist movement, which, once it accomplished its goal, it disbanded and its members moved on to other things. Imagine having an 1840s style of abolitionist movement today. That would be quite terrible. In any event, whenever we talk about our positive view of the world, sooner or later we will mention phrases like smaller government, limited government, or in the more sophisticated American version, a government that fits into the Constitution. There are these are of course very great campaign slogans and an efficient way to describe what is an otherwise quite complex worldview, but it still nonetheless leaves room for questions. How small? How limited? Who adjudicates? And my favorite question, how do you make sure it doesn't grow again? And there's also the specific question asked by our supporter, how would a small government fight against cartels and crony capitalism in general, which we will treat in a separate chapter. Now, obviously, this presentation comes with certain limitations, one being the issue of time constraints and another one being the issue of subjectivity. While everyone in the liberty sector agrees that the government should be significantly smaller than it is today, not everyone agrees on just how small should the state be, should the state authority be. So as a result, most of the prescriptive statements I will be making in the following minutes are, of course, heavily influenced by the subjectivity of the speaker, which is a very fancy way of saying my opinion. So, having said that, and having acknowledged that I don't own the whole truth on the matter, this presentation is divided as follows. 1. Historical functional models of small government. 2. Limitations of small government. 3. The question of morality. 4. Present-day prevailing thoughts on the matter. 5. The cronyism question. And finally, number 6, personal opinion, final analysis, and conclusions. As always, I'm trying my best to separate my own opinions from the rest of the talk, which is a practice that is obviously not conducive to my popularity, as people like to see videos expressing a definitive opinion, but is a practice that keeps both myself and the audience as grounded as possible to reality. It's a conservative practice, if you like. So let us begin. Number one, historical functional models of small government. Now, one slogan used both by the believers in big government and the believers in liberty is that everyone starts with a small government, which, although it's a cliche, it is nonetheless true. The vast majority of the governments today were, at some point in their earlier days, quite small and functional by the standards of the current year. However, few of them remained so, or at the very least attempted to remain so. There are 6 countries today that could reasonably be considered smaller government places. These are as follows: Chile, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, San Marino, Republic of Georgia, and the United States, with the United States being the biggest out of the club, and for many years outside of this club. The one nice thing about Trump is that the government has started again to shrink, at least for now, which is good. But it's not shrinking fast enough for sure, and with the latest budget, we're gonna have some doubts yet again. Now, looking at this list, the first thing we notice is that all of these countries are exceptional in some way. The United States is the only country built entirely on ideas. Liechtenstein is a medieval style of principality that shouldn't even exist in the modern era, but it does. For instance, in Liechtenstein, municipalities have the constitutionally protected right to secede from the country if they don't like how the government is running the country. Now, how's that for checks and balances? Then there is, of course, San Marino, which is the oldest constitutional republic in the world, and I would argue the host of the most astute diplomacy in human history. I mean, you don't get to stay on the map continuously with the exact same territory for over 1700 years, being landlocked and surrounded by Italy without some bloody good diplomacy. Then there's Switzerland, which has the best natural defense walls that one can have anywhere in the world. I mean, evading Switzerland is a bloody difficult task, which many have tried, but with rather limited success. Like San Marino, Switzerland also has and has had, historically speaking, a top-notch diplomacy and, like the United States, a heavily armed population to act both as a defense force for the external threats, but also as an extra check on the tendencies of the federal government to expand beyond its mandate, although in the case of Switzerland it will be the confederal government. And then there's Chile, a country which is a more recent addition to this club, largely thanks to Augusto Pinochet, who, quite shockingly for a dictator, outright admitted that he has no idea what he was doing on economics and made the bold move of inviting people who actually understand economics into the country and let those people run the place on the economic front. By the way, just a side note, Pinochet did not helicopter communists, or at the very least there is no evidence of that. The vuelos de la muerte, or the death flights in which individuals were thrown out from a helicopter into the ocean, were practiced in Argentina in the same period between 1976 and I think 1983 by the organization called the Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, which was a military junta which seized power also from the communists. The difference is that in Argentina the junta failed, since Argentina is still communist today. Maybe they had old helicopters. Who knows? Well, there are many reasons, but that's outside the scope of this talk. So, unlike Argentina, in Chile, the military junta did work, and the South American country bucked the trend and became one of the wealthiest and freest countries on the planet and in human history, although not as wealthy as the United States or Switzerland, but still around that ballpark. And considering that in 1971 Chile was one of the poorest nations in the world, things look quite great in Chile. And then there is also the Republic of Georgia, which is the newest addition to this club, and it is work in progress. Like Chile, Georgia had a knight in a shining armor, a savior, if you like. The policies of Mikhail Saakashvili for firing over 2/3 of the state employees, privatizing huge chunks of the state services, and abolishing huge chunks of the body of legislation have played a tremendous role in transforming Georgia from a regular, highly corrupt post-Soviet country into one of the least corrupted places on earth. Since most of these policies are rather new, it's still too early to talk about effects, though I have shown you in the Georgia tour that there are indeed positive effects already. The wealth of the common man has finally started to grow after stagnation and indeed decrease during both the Soviet times and the 15 years or so after gaining independence. Safety on the streets and safety of investments have become the absolute norm, and the country today is a giant construction site as seemingly all corners of the Georgian society are finally developing after decades of stagnation and rot. Will that continue? Probably so, but it's too early to tell. So, looking at these examples, there are quite a few conclusions that are kind of mandatory to draw. First, small government is exceptional, not just that it is both historical and present-day exception to the rule, but that it also requires exceptional work and exceptional circumstances. Number two, it might not be for everyone. Although many people, including myself, would love to see this model extended to as many places as possible, in part because it bloody works, the evidence so far points in the direction that the model might not be for everyone. Now, part of that is because of the people themselves, and I will address this later on in the question of morality, but part of it is because geography and other immutable characteristics. Can a country like Lithuania, for instance, be a small government? In theory, yes, but when you have a neighbor that literally regards you as its suburb, that would be Russia, things become a bit complex, to say the least. Conclusion number 3. Small government requires extraordinary political will. The adage attributed to Thomas Jefferson that the natural progress of things is for the government to gain ground and for liberty to yield holds true throughout history. And if we look closer to our list, in all 6 of them, there was the kind of extraordinary political will of people who could have wanted more things from and with the government, but purposefully elected not to do so, and purposefully elected to do their best to prevent both themselves and others from wanting to grow the government. Now, I won't talk about the United States too much because obviously there are a gazillion videos on YouTube about checks and balances of the US governance system and the history of it. You can watch those. I will take the liberty to assume that most of those things are known already. But look at the other places on the list. Pinochet was both de jure and de facto a dictator. He could have elected to enrich himself, like Fidel Castro did, who was worth about $1 billion when he died. Saakashvili could have just played along like his predecessors, make a few millions off the back of the state, and then quietly retreat somewhere nice and warm. Yet he elected to ruin the corruption system, forfeit his chance of enrichment, and run the risk of being assassinated or at the very least hounded for the rest of his life, which actually did happen. Not to mention the US founding fathers, who were all committing high treason when they signed the Declaration of Independence, and some of them did in fact end up being killed for their treasonous act of wanting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This kind of political will is just not common. And finally, conclusion number 4 on this subtopic, small government is a struggle. Just like liberty in general, small government is not on the side of entropy, which means that establishing a small government does not come without challenges, and the challenges never really end. Think about Switzerland, for instance. Constantly pressured to do things it did not really want, such as joining the European Union, establish a minimum wage, open its borders to diversity and progress, and many, many other things, some of which were having been successfully resisted so far, others not so much. And this is the next topic. So, point number 2. Limitations of small government. Small government isn't a panacea to all problems, and I say this as a hardliner on the topic of small government myself. Small government has practical limitations, such as the limitation that not only you don't have, but you cannot have procedures for everything under the sun. In economics, that's usually a fantastic thing because it means unfettered innovation into many areas and usually very fast economic growth and prosperity for the citizenry. In areas of social liberty, this is also usually a great thing because the pursuit of happiness is almost guaranteed in such an environment. However, this becomes a problem in matters of foreign policy, and there is no definitive answer on how to solve this, or if indeed there is a solving to this. I suspect there isn't, because like all things in life, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Switzerland, for instance, mitigated the issue by having a top-notch diplomacy, whilst the United States mitigated the issue by having what some dubbed as the military-industrial complex, or in more friendly terms, diplomacy with a big stick. Now, both approaches have their strengths and are at least in part, determined by immutable characteristics, specifically geography. I mean, it's one thing when you're smaller than West Virginia, sandwiched between Italy and France, and a whole other thing when you're larger than Europe itself, flanked by 2 oceans. Such immutable characteristics will necessarily determine different outcomes when it comes to foreign policy, even though both of them started with a limited government framework. In both cases, though, the approaches were not perfect. In the case of the United States, there is the continuous criticism of expanding federal power by the back door in the name of national security, and at least some of that criticism is very legitimate. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, there is the criticism that the diplomatic approach oftentimes allowed the subversion of the Swiss public and the enactment of measures that were far from conducive to the well-being of the Swiss Confederacy, such as the abandonment of the gold standard or the abolition of the bank secrecy policies. In the case of the newer additions to the club, the fact that the state of affairs came to being due to political will of essentially one man, Augusto Pinochet in the case of Chile and Mikhail Saakashvili in the case of Georgia, this means there is always a subversion risk by having the enemies of liberty constantly demonizing the person responsible. Mind you, this is true for older members too. I mean, the left has been trying to chip away at the foundation of the American Republic for decades now by downplaying the founding fathers and smearing them as racist, sexist, homophobes, and similar other epithets. But since those people are already dead and far away back in history, the success of such smearing is inherently limited. In the case of newer members, though, the smearing still works, particularly when it comes to Georgia, where the architect of the small government framework is still alive. And this is a limitation of small government, because there is nothing you can really do against this. Well, other than starting up the rotors, I mean. The only thing you can do is to cultivate a decent citizenry, which will then deploy on its own some countermeasures. But that's not easy to do either. And that's the next topic. The question of morality. Point number 3. Now, this one is not easy either. 2 quotes for you. First, Robert Winthrop. Quote, "Men, in a word, must necessarily be controlled either by a power within them or by a power without them. Either by the word of God or by the strong arm of the man, either by the Bible or by the bayonet." Close quote. Second quote. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Close quote. This one is by John Adams. What these two men correctly identified is that for the liberty-oriented small government to stay small, the citizenry must be, generally speaking, virtuous. Now, for reasons of political expedience, many of the American founding fathers believed religion was a good vehicle for that, although not all of them agreed necessarily on that. Thomas Paine, for instance, was quite harsh on the topic of religion. Christian militants wrongly interpret the founding fathers as having said that only religion, or specifically Christianity, is fit for the purpose. But that's not necessarily the case, and that was also not a consensus among the founding fathers in the 18th century either. The first quote by Robert Winthrop might as well have been the founding adage of Switzerland, since there are, and always were, so many religious denominations within Switzerland which were still at war with each other at the time of the formation of Switzerland. They went with the bayonet. If everyone is armed, then there will be peace because you don't want to piss off your neighbor. And the neighbor doesn't want to piss off you either. In any event, no matter how you slice this, the question of morality cannot and will not go away in a small government setup. And the question is still around today. If you look at the 6 countries that we used as examples here, they are all special in some way, shape, or form. Liechtenstein and San Marino are particularly traditionalist places with a heavy bias towards practices that have passed the test of time and a strong degree of skepticism towards change of any kind. If it ain't broken, don't try to fix it. This one might as well be the motto of Liechtenstein, which under pressure from the Council of Europe organized a referendum in 2012 to remove the powers of the monarch. With a majority of 3-1, the citizens of Liechtenstein told the Council of Europe to buzz off. That was quite a shock for the Bruxellian elite, which regularly just assumes that political power in the hands of an aristocracy is bad in and of itself and that nobody really wants it. Yet in Liechtenstein, that arrangement has passed the test of time and it works just fine. Such exceptionalism is found in the other examples as well. The United States is still the most religious country in the developed world, followed by, guess who? Switzerland. While most of Europe is quite secularized, in Switzerland you still have more than 2/3 of the populace still regularly attending church, and most Swiss cantons recognize an official church, something which would be illegal in the United States. Such numbers can only be found in the Intermarium, particularly Poland and Greece, but not so much in the rest of Europe. Same goes with Georgia and Chile, both deeply religious societies. Now, while Chile has the second highest number of non-believers in South America, you still have more than half of the country being Roman Catholic, and overall 3/4 of the country practice some form of Christianity. In Georgia, the influence of religion is so strong that the Georgian Patriarch of the Orthodox Church was able to single-handedly convince women to have more children by promising to personally baptize them. And here's the thing, it worked. Another common thread of these examples is the chronic lack of adherence to the religion of peace. For some reason, could be because, I don't know, maybe Islam is a fascistic command and control political system, but we won't say that because that's hate speech. So, for some reason, Islamic areas haven't been particularly great at producing small government societies. And the presence of adherents to the religion of peace in big numbers doesn't appear to be conducive to a free society. This argument is being played out as we speak, particularly if we look at Sweden, Germany, and the United Kingdom, countries whose government has significantly increased in size, scope, and power since the cultural enrichment happened. Is there a mitigating policy for this? I'm afraid it isn't. Other than keeping Islam as far away as possible, that is. There is one interesting case in Kyrgyzstan, a small country in Central Asia, which is currently trying to build a small government society with one particular caveat: no religious proselytism allowed, a policy which in theory applies to all religious proselytism, but in practice it is obviously directed at Islamist preaching. But can you blame them? One cursory glance at their neighbors and it becomes quite clear that in their immutable circumstances, such a policy could be quite sensible. And I say could be because Kyrgyzstan just began the process and it's too early to tell where it will go. Can you have a liberty-oriented small government set up without the right to proselytize religion? I don't know. The theory says you can't, but the theory was written before the threat of Islamism existed, or at the very least, the threat of Islamism was being aware, the people writing it were aware of it. So maybe the theory is wrong? I don't know, and nobody knows. It's an open question to which Kyrgyzstan might provide the answer in about 20 years or so. But until that happens, Kyrgyzstan is working on the same assumption, that you cannot have a small government situation without a moral populace. And from that assumption, they formulated a policy meant to curb what they believe to be a source of brutal immorality. Now, will that work? Who knows? But the question of morality still does remain around because the point of a small government liberty-oriented setup is to have the passions of men limited within rather than without or from top-down decrees, while allowing a much larger degree of variation to exist than it can exist or indeed does exist in big government societies. The only majority atheist society heading towards a smaller government situation is Czechia or the Czech Republic. It's not there yet, but out of the countries that are majority atheist, the Czech Republic is by far the best. I mean, the alternatives are Sweden, Iceland, North Korea, China, Azerbaijan, believe it or not, Australia, Belgium, and Japan. Now, of course, we can quibble about the numbers and definitions for several weeks, but essentially in these places more than 50% of the populace has no religion, practices no religion, or is outright atheistic. Of these, the Czech Republic is by far the finest and the freest. But Czechia is also distinctly lacking members of the religion of peace in significant numbers. So this would further suggest two things. On one hand, it suggests that you can have a moral society that at the very least aspires to small government even without general or generalized religion. And on the other hand, it also suggests that the consistent correlation between little or no Islamic presence and liberty might not be accidental. In any event, the question of morality will have to be addressed more thoroughly by those who believe in small government because it is an essential one. Admittedly, it is not an urgent one since most of the planet is very far away from small government and it's not like tomorrow we're getting most of the policies we want, but still. And for this issue, most of the present-day libertarians are indeed very ill-equipped to address it, because too many libertarians appear to believe that if you just have free markets, everything else will fall into place. But that's a hypothesis at best and extreme naivete about human nature at worst. Free markets do indeed solve many things, most things actually, but free markets will not solve morality, nor will they necessarily bring morality. They might, but it's not a given. Alright, let's go to point number 4. present-day prevailing thoughts on the matter. Now, I won't spend much time on this issue because I speak about this quite routinely, and I would rather have this video shorter than longer. The general consensus among the proponents of small government is that we are in deep shit, let's fix that and figure out the fine details later. Which is not an unreasonable stance at all. And it's a stance born out of political pragmatism. After all, I don't agree with everything anyone says, but practical politics tells me that perfect is the enemy of good. And that good enough is sometimes good enough. So, if tomorrow a politician emerges that wants a 15% state, I'll rush to the polls and to volunteer for his or her campaign. Sure, I would prefer a 10% state, but in Europe, most countries have a 60% state. So scaling it down to even to 30% would still be a significant improvement. And this is one of the reasons why present-day thought is very rarely concerned with fine details. Because when you're in such a big trouble, the question of morality within a 10% state sounds ridiculous and indeed kind of out of touch. It's as if you'd be concerning yourself how would you manage your $10 million blind trust in the Cayman Islands when you can't even pay your rent in time. For many present-day thinkers, deep philosophical questions come out as a waste of time and not without reason. After all, what's the point in discussing how will morality come to be in a small government setup when you have supposedly liberal democracies who kidnap children from their families because the families don't go along with the militant transgenderist agenda? In my view, this is a missed opportunity because a common thread of morality can indeed come exactly from a reaffirmation of such self-evident truths, such as that men cannot become women, that men and women are indeed different, that diversity is not necessarily a good thing, or that state-enforced racism is cancer, and things of that nature. Any morality system worth holding has to derive from self-evident truths, and with the decline of traditional organized religion, small government proponents could try to reconstruct from the pieces in such a way that makes sense for most people most of the time. Anyway, this is a very long sub-thread and the video is getting quite long. So let's get to point number 5, the cronyism question, which is a very specific policy question asked by our supporters. So this question emerges out of a context that is historically non-existent and from a set of ideas that are just as wrong today as they were in the 19th century when they emerged. The story goes like this. Monopolies happen and that's allegedly a bad thing in and of itself, and only the government can fix that by breaking up the monopolies. The problem is that the whole story is wrong. Partly because it is based entirely on wrong premises. First of all, not all monopolies are created equal. As a result, not all monopolies have equal results. When we discuss monopolies, or so-called monopolies, invariably the discussion goes back to the oldest antitrust piece of legislation, which is the Sherman Act in the United States. And that discussion usually goes to the Standard Oil case. But Standard Oil was not the first case. Let me read you something from the Austrian Economics newsletter published 27 years ago in 1991. A very long quote. So it goes like this. In introducing federal antitrust legislation, Senator Sherman and his congressional allies claimed that combinations of trusts tended to restrict output and thus drive up prices. If Sherman's claims were true, then there should be evidence that those industries allegedly being monopolized by the trusts had restricted output. By contrast, if the trust movement was part of the evolutionary process of competitive markets responding to technological change, one would expect an expansion of trade or output. In fact, there is no evidence that trusts in the 1880s were restricting output or artificially increasing prices. The congressional record of the 51st Congress provides a list of industries that were supposedly being monopolized by the trusts. Those industries for which data are available are salt, petroleum, zinc, steel, bituminous, coal, steel rails, sugar, lead, liquor, twine, iron nuts, and washers, jute, castor oil, cotton seed oil, leather, linseed oil, and matches. The available data are incomplete, but in all but 2 of the 17 industries, output increased not only from the 1880 to 1890, but also to the turn of the century. Matches and castor oil, the only exceptions to the general rule, hardly seem to be items that would cause a national furor, even if they were monopolized. As a general rule, output in these industries expanded more rapidly than GNP during the 10 years preceding the Sherman Act. In the 9 industries for which nominal output data are available, output increased on average by 62%. Nominal GDP increased by 16% over the same period. Several of the industries expanded output by more than 10 times the increase in nominal GNP. Among the more rapidly expanding industries were cottonseed oil 151%, leather goods, cordage and twine, and jute. Real GNP increased by approximately 24% from 1880 to 1890. Meanwhile, the allegedly monopolized industries for which a measure of real output is available grew on average by 175%. These trends continued from 1890 to 1900 as output expanded in every industry but one for which we have data. Castor oil was the exception. On average, the allegedly monopolized industries continued to expand faster than the rest of the economy. Those industries for which nominal data are available expanded output by 99%, while nominal GNP increased by 43%. The industries for which we have data increased real output by 76% compared with the 46% increase in real GNP from 1890 to 1900. As with measures of output, not all of the relevant price data are available, but the information that is at hand indicates that falling prices accompanied the rapid expansion of output in the so-called monopolized industries. In addition, although the consumer price index fell by 7% from 1880 to 1890, prices in many suspect industries were falling even faster. The average price of steel rails, for example, fell by 53% from $68 per ton in 1880 to $32 per ton in 1890. The price of refined sugar fell from 9 cents per pound in 1880 to 7 cents per pound in 1890 to 4.5 cents in 1900. The price of lead dropped 12%. The price of zinc declined by 20%. The sugar and petroleum trusts were among the most widely attacked, but there is evidence that these trusts actually reduced prices from what they otherwise would have been. Congress clearly recognized this. During the House debates over the Sherman Act, Congressman William Mason stated, quote, "Trusts have made products cheaper, have reduced prices, but if the price of oil, for instance, were reduced to 1 cent a barrel, it would not right the wrong done to the people of this country by the trusts which have destroyed legitimate competition and driven honest men from legitimate business enterprises," close quote. Senator Edwards, who played a key role in the debate, added, quote, "Although for the time being the sugar trust has perhaps reduced the price of sugar and the oil trust certainly has reduced the price of oil immensely, that does not alter the wrong of the principle of any trust. Perhaps it would be more accurate to describe the Sherman Act as the anti-price cutting law." One final argument could be made that the trusts were practicing predatory pricing, that is, that they were pricing below their costs to drive out competitors. But in more than a century of looking for a proven real-world monopoly actually created by predatory pricing, an example has yet to be found. Moreover, prices charged by the 19th century trusts continued to fall for more than a decade. What rational businessman would continue to price below cost for more than 10 years? In sum, the 19th century trusts were not guilty of the charge levied against them by Senator Sherman. There is no consistent evidence that they have restricted output to raise prices, close quote. The story is essentially the same Everywhere else, so-called anti-monopoly legislation has been adopted. It was never about public good, but rather the good of certain industries who were pissed off about the fact that they were being outcompeted by far more efficient players who could offer the exact same or superior products and services at smaller prices. The United States needed over 100 years to figure this one out, but it eventually did. In the current year, Sherman Act trials are no longer being adjudicated in the terms that Senator Sherman was discussing in the 19th century. The courts have continued to include caveats in the case law explaining that a case is legitimate only if it can be proven that the alleged monopoly has actually harmed the consumers. In other words, just because you have a dominant position on a specific market, that does not make you a priori wrong or evil. As long as the consumers are happy and no unsuspected party is being harmed, then no harm has been done. The fact that less efficient competitors are being driven out of business, that's not a bad thing. Quite the opposite. Free markets necessarily do contain this element called creative destruction. Antitrust legislation was born out of the frustration of the less efficient who, instead of competing better, went to whine to the government and tried to get some privileges for themselves at the expense of more efficient, legitimate players in the market. I will leave, of course, links in the low bar, and I urge you to read that particular article because you will see that legislation, such as the Sherman Act, was many things, but definitely not a legitimate move for the public good. In fact, quite the opposite was the case, because ultimately the only true source of monopoly is the government itself. Basically, cronyism cannot exist if the government cannot pick winners and losers. If a small government, in a small government setup, if a company that is in a dominant position fucks it up, sooner or later it goes out of business. I mean, do you remember IBM? Yeah, sure, they're still around, by the way, but at one time they were considered for an antitrust lawsuit, and there were quite a few naive fools at the time to believe that IBM would end up swallowing everything and controlling everyone unless it was broken up by the savior government. The same was true for Nokia at some point, or for Microsoft, and for many other companies which were at some point bloody huge. But unless the government steps in to explicitly favor them, such companies can only remain in a dominant position if and only if they can serve their customers well. And notice that I say dominant position because there really is no such thing as a monopoly in the free market. The only monopoly is the government-sanctioned monopoly, such as Systembolaget in Sweden, which is the state-owned chain store that has the sole authority to sell alcohol. Now that is a monopoly, because competition is outright banned. There is no equivalent like that in the free market. At any given moment in time, no matter how big and powerful the dominant player may be, competition will always exist, and still does exist. Pick your real-world example and I'll give you counterexamples. Then, of course, on the issue of cronyism and antitrust legislation, there is the issue of practicality. No matter how much you try, and legislators and judges both in Europe and North America have been trying tirelessly for the last 100 years or so, but no matter how much you try, the policies resulted from this deeply misguided impulse will necessarily end up being brutally insane. Strictly by the competition law in any country that has them, if you sell your product cheaper than your competitors, you are potentially liable for a dumping lawsuit. If you practice higher prices, then you're price gouging or engaging in predatory pricing. If you sell it at the exact same price as your competitors, then you'll necessarily be legally harassed for potentially having formed a cartel. It's basically the same principle as the old Soviet joke with the worker going to the factory. When he turned up late, he was sanctioned because the Soviet production was suffering because of him. When he turned up earlier than the start of the program, he was sanctioned again for making his co-workers feel bad. When he finally arrived just on time, the NKVD was called up and he was whisked away for an interview because he clearly had a Swiss watch. This is how competition law actually works. No matter what you do, the enterprise is a priori presumed evil, and the state is a priori presumed not just good, but also a legitimate representative of the client, which is usually quite far from the truth. So, how can a small government fight cronyism? By not engaging it. If the government has no favors to offer, there cannot be any cronyism. As for cartels, the only thing the government can and indeed should do is to provide fair courts for redress. Let the actually affected clients sue the alleged offender and the onus be placed on the plaintiff to prove actual harm being done, rather than the antitrust situation of today, where the onus is constantly on the enterprise. Antitrust is the only portion of the criminal law where the accused must prove his innocence. And this state of affairs is tolerated because most people are either unaware of this happening, and those that are aware tend to be economically illiterate, or at the very least highly resentful and emotion-driven individuals. Contrary to the leftist narrative, corporations, large and small, are indeed people. You don't put the headquarters of Intel in jail. You put the people from Intel in jail. Same goes with fines. Yes, the check for the fine might be written in the name of the legal entity Intel Incorporated, but the shekels come from people who would have spent that on something far more useful than, let's say, the budget of the European Union. And I'm referring here specifically to the huge fines applied by the European Commission to Intel for alleged abuse of dominant power. Yet for some reason, the Commission was not able to find a single client who was harmed by that alleged abuse. Anyway, millions of clients were harmed by the fine itself, when suddenly Intel products started disappearing from the market or being priced higher. But that's, I guess, a story for another day. Alright, let's end this with a few personal opinions. First of all, I'm not an idealist, but also I'm not a German. What I mean by this is that I'm not just aware, but perfectly okay with the fact that a small government would not fix all the issues. It is not perfect, but it's good enough, and certainly superior to the status quo. What I mean by I'm not German is that I do not subscribe at all to the German school of thought that any policy needs to be planned in great detail and then the plan needs to be executed meticulously and thoroughly. Not only I don't subscribe to this kind of view, but I consider it to be inefficient, inflexible, and outright wrong. When you're dealing with people, there are things you simply cannot foresee, and there's nothing wrong with that. But having a rigid plan prevents you from adapting to the feedback and, as a consequence, decreases the chances of success. Because history teaches us that nations are not equal and people are not equal. So the exact same goal will necessarily have to be achieved in a different manner for different people. Also, the goal cannot be identical either. For some countries, the right balance might be as low as a 5% state, whilst for others, especially those who might, at least for a while, need bigger militaries, the right balance could be as high as 15% or maybe 17%. There is no way you can predict this beforehand, which is also why I'm a proponent of gradual reductions. And by gradual, I mean over a span of at the very least 20 years, if not more than that. The gradual approach over a longer period of time is necessary for the simple reason that you need to give time to the society to, well, heal itself. I mean, many people, including people on the small government side, don't realize just how wounded our societies are already by the evils of big government. If we were to suddenly reduce the state from 60% to 10%, things would go really wrong really fast. Because most people have never, ever in their entire lives known any sort of liberty. And liberty is hard. I mean, it really is. It means personal responsibility to degrees that most people in Europe can hardly even begin to imagine at this point. It also means responsibility to one's family and immediate community, also to degrees hard to imagine, especially to urban dwellers both in Europe and North America. With so many generations brought up with slogans like, oh, there ought to be a law, and whose instinct is to start expressing policy in terms of the government should, that will take decades to be undone. It absolutely is doable, but it's not going to be easy. Also, unlike any other moment in history, we are in a place far more totalitarian than really most of history. I mean, in some aspects, we're in a place worse than the traditional go-to places for examples of totalitarianism, namely the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. I mean, at the very least, the Nazi Germany would drop the charges of grossly offensive speech if you taught your dog to do the Nazi salute. So-called modern and liberal democracies won't. Also, at the very least, the Soviet Union would allow you to do a sleepover and to sleep however you damn please in your house and allow you to invite homeless people and give them a place to sleep as well. So-called modern and liberal democracies won't. And I wish I were joking or exaggerating, but I'm not. In many regards, Europe, particularly its western half, and North America are more totalitarian than any society in history. Yes, there aren't mass murders anymore, but mass murder is not the only facet of totalitarianism, and as the saying goes, it is sometimes preferable to die in your feet than live on your knees. Or as we used to say here, better dead than red. You know, I was joking a few years ago that my people fought for over 500 years against the Ottoman Empire, even though the Ottoman Empire didn't want to build mosques here, but the European Union does, and the Ottoman tax was 10%, a sixth of what it is today for those who can't avoid them thanks to EU regulations. Death by 1,000 cuts indeed. The point I'm trying to make here is that so much harm has been done that it is no longer fixable via a revolution the classical way. It will require far more sophisticated approaches and decades of work in active measures, subversion, agitprop and all the rest. Making our civilization great again will come at a great cost for us, and I mean specifically us, those of us who are basically under 40. Likely none of us will get to see the final product. So in a way, we will have to defer some of the questions to our grandchildren because they will be closer to implementing them and thus closer to the realities on the ground. They will have more data on which to build up their answers. Hopefully, they will come up with virtuous answers. There is no magic bullet. There are no solutions. Just a long, very long stream of trade-offs. And that's why it's called the tragic vision. So, how small should the government be? My preference is for a 10% state, but that's decades down the road. Until then, I will go with the Milton Friedman principle. I support any reduction of any tax, tariff, fee, or budget for any reason in any area of the government and without reservation. We are not yet in the position to pick and choose. The whole damn thing is over bloated. So yeah, that's all I had to say. I hope this does answer to the questions of our patron, and it also adds some perspective to the whole issue. I admit this is a rather atypical video for me, especially in this period in which I insist a lot more on practical politics, but from time to time we still do need to ask ourselves these big questions, because if we don't, we run the risk of losing sight of the purpose. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do subscribe to my social media. Please do consider throwing a shekel if you derive any value from the work being done here. And I will see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.